sniper's bullet stole his eye, but it forged an icon for a nation. That black patch became a symbol not of what was lost, but of Israel's unyielding will to survive. Moshe Dayan was the embodiment of the Sabra, the architect of lightning victories in the face of triumph. He led from the front, believing history was written by those who dared. Yet the man who conquered Jerusalem would face his darkest hour when his nation teetered on the brink of destruction, forcing the ultimate warrior to seek a different path. Your support matters. Like, subscribe, and leave one comment. Thank you. Moshe Dayan was born not in a city or a town, but in an idea made real. He was the first child of Kibbutz Degania Aleph, the very first collective settlement, a small, dusty outpost of revolutionary hope on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. His parents, Shmuel and Devorah, were pioneers who had fled the violent pogroms of the Russian Empire, trading persecution for the immense hardship of reclaiming a malarial and neglected land. They were driven by a burning Zionist idealism, a belief that the Jewish people must work their own soil to truly possess it. This was the world that shaped Dayan from his first breath. It was a world where the line between farmer and soldier did not exist, where the shovel and the rifle were twin instruments of survival. This unique upbringing forged in him an unbreakable bond with the earth he walked on. He was a Sabra, a native son, part of a new generation that had no memory of exile. For him, the land was not an abstract concept or a distant dream. It was the dirt under his fingernails and the sun on his back. Survival was a daily struggle, not just against the harsh climate, but against the constant threat of Arab marauders who saw the fledgling Jewish settlements as an intrusion. Self-defense was woven into the fabric of life, a skill as essential as plowing a field or harvesting a crop. This reality crystallized his worldview early on, a philosophy he would later articulate with stark clarity. He said, "We are a generation of settlers, and without the steel helmet and the cannon's fire, we will not be able to plant a tree or build a house." It was this profound sense of duty that led him, at the young age of 14, to join the Haganah. This was not an act of adolescent rebellion, but a solemn rite of passage, an acceptance of the responsibility his generation was born into. The Haganah was the underground Jewish defense force, an illegal entity in the eyes of the British Mandate authorities who governed Palestine. Its members trained in secret, often in darkness, their footsteps muffled in the sand of remote wadis. They drilled with a motley collection of smuggled and homemade weapons, always aware that discovery meant arrest and imprisonment by the British. Dayan's initial duties were the unglamorous but vital tasks of a sentinel. He stood guard over the kibbutz fields at night, patrolled the perimeters of nearby settlements, and learned to read the landscape like a text. He mastered the fundamentals of fieldcraft, developing an almost animalistic sense of his surroundings. He learned the patience of marksmanship with precious few bullets to spare. Most importantly, these early experiences taught him that a passive, reactive defense was a recipe for disaster. He understood that survival depended on anticipating threats and seizing the initiative, a principle that would become the bedrock of his military doctrine. His true military education, however, began under the tutelage of a most unlikely mentor, a fiercely unconventional British Army captain named Ord Wingate. A devout Christian and an ardent Zionist, Wingate saw the Jewish struggle as a righteous cause. He despised the static, defensive posture of the British forces and the Haganah leadership. He believed the only way to defeat the marauding gangs was to hunt them on their own terms, using their own tactics of stealth and surprise. To do this, he created the Special Night Squads, a mixed unit of British soldiers and Haganah volunteers. For Moshe Dayan, Wingate was a revelation. Here was a commander who preached what Dayan had instinctively come to believe, that the best defense was a swift, aggressive offense. He eagerly joined the Special Night Squads and thrived in the demanding environment. Under Wingate's command, he participated in daring, preemptive raids, moving silently through the darkness to ambush enemy forces before they could attack Jewish settlements. Wingate was a master of unconventional warfare, teaching his men the value of speed, intelligence, and relentless pressure. Crucially, he led from the very front, sharing every risk his men faced. In Wingate, Dayan found the archetype of the commander he would strive to become: audacious, innovative, and always leading by example. He was becoming a formidable soldier, but a single bullet from a distant rifle was about to forge his body, his identity, and his iconic image forever. The year was 1941, and the shadow of the Second World War stretched across the Middle East. The Allied powers, locked in a global struggle, turned their attention to Lebanon and Syria, territories controlled by Vichy France and its collaborationist regime. For the British, this was an intolerable threat on the doorstep of Palestine. For the Jewish Yishuv and its defense force, the Haganah, it was a chance to fight a common enemy. Moshe Dayan, recently released from a British prison, was now a valued asset. He was assigned to the Palmach, the Haganah's newly formed elite strike force, a precursor to the special forces of the future Israeli Defense Forces. His intimate knowledge of the rugged border terrain and his fluency in Arabic made him the perfect scout. Dayan found himself attached to an Australian infantry unit, a strange but necessary wartime alliance. He was the guide, the tip of the spear for a formal military force advancing into hostile territory. The tension was palpable. He was operating in a gray zone between his underground militia experience and the rigid structure of a conventional army. Every ridgeline could hide a machine gun nest. Every village could harbor an ambush. His job was to see the danger before the Australians walked into it, to lead them across the Litani River and secure a key bridge. It was a mission that demanded precision, courage, and an almost preternatural awareness of the landscape. He moved with a quiet confidence, earning the respect of the tough Australian soldiers who followed his lead. On the 7th of June, Dayan and a small team reached their objective, a police station held by Vichy forces. They took cover on the roof of a nearby building, the morning sun warming the stone beneath them. From this vantage point, Dayan could survey the enemy's defenses. He unslung his binoculars, a familiar and trusted tool, and raised them to his eyes. The world resolved into a magnified circle of detail: sandbags, a sentry, the glint of a rifle barrel. He was completely focused, his mind processing the tactical situation, his body still. It was in this moment of intense concentration that his life was irrevocably altered. A single sharp crack echoed from the police station across the river. The sniper's bullet, fired with lethal accuracy, did not strike his flesh directly. Instead, it slammed into the metal housing of his left binocular lens. The impact was catastrophic. The high-velocity round obliterated the instrument, transferring its kinetic energy into a deadly explosion of metal and glass. Shards of the shattered lens and twisted brass were propelled with immense force directly into Dayan's left eye socket. The pain was an instantaneous, blinding supernova. It was not a sharp sting, but a deep, searing agony that felt as if his skull had been split open. He was thrown backward by the force of the blow, the ruined binoculars falling from his grasp. His world became a vortex of white-hot pain and sudden darkness on one side. Blood poured down his face, warm and thick. Yet, through the torment, the soldier's discipline held firm. There was no scream, no panicked cry for help. He remained conscious, his mind reeling but not broken. He instinctively pressed a hand to the wound, feeling the jagged fragments embedded in the tissue around his eye. His comrades rushed to his side, their faces a mixture of shock and horror at the grievous injury. They frantically tried to apply a field dressing, their movements urgent as they worked to staunch the bleeding and shield the wound from the dust and sun. For 6 agonizing hours, he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness while waiting for evacuation, his war seemingly over. But the war for Moshe Dayan was only just beginning. The initial medical treatment in Haifa was a desperate attempt to save the eye, but the damage was too profound. The tiny razor-sharp splinters of glass and metal had shredded the delicate muscles that controlled the eyeball's movement. A glass eye, the common solution for such an injury, was impossible. The doctors delivered the grim news. The eye was lost and the socket was too damaged to hold a prosthesis. He would have to wear a simple patch for the rest of his life. For any other man, it might have been a mark of defeat, a career-ending disability that relegated him to the shadows. Dayan, however, was not any other man. He refused to see the black patch as a symbol of loss. Instead, he transformed it into a badge of sacrifice, a powerful emblem of his commitment. The injury, suffered in the defense of the land, became an integral part of his identity. The patch was a stark, silent declaration of his personal history and his unwavering resolve. It communicated more than any speech ever could. It told a story of courage under fire, of a price paid willingly in the long and arduous struggle for a Jewish homeland. This simple piece of black cloth instantly set him apart, creating an unforgettable and formidable public persona. It was a visual shorthand for resilience, a symbol that resonated deeply with a nation that understood the cost of survival. The farmer and soldier from Degania had been wounded, but in that wounding, an icon was forged. The black eye patch became synonymous with Israeli strength and the unyielding will to endure, a permanent fixture on the face of a man who was destined for greatness. With his legendary image now sealed in the crucible of combat, Dayan would return to the fight for Israel's very existence. His battlefield audacity and his now famous emblem of sacrifice would be needed on the most critical front of all, the divided and contested city of Jerusalem. The year was 1948. As the British mandate expired, Israel declared its independence, a fragile flicker of hope in a hostile world. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The armies of 5 Arab nations invaded, determined to extinguish the newborn state before it could draw its first breath. The fighting was desperate, a chaotic maelstrom of small units, limited ammunition, and immense courage against staggering odds. In this crucible, Moshe Dayan, now a commander in the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces, found his element. He was given command of the 89th Commando Battalion, a motley but aggressive mechanized unit. It was a force built in his own image, comprised of jeeps and makeshift armored cars designed for speed, shock, and audacity. He was not a general who commanded from the rear. He led from the very front, and his most legendary action of the war would prove it. The target was the strategic Arab town of Lydda, a heavily defended fortress on the road to Tel Aviv. A conventional assault would be a bloody, protracted affair. Dayan had no time for convention. He devised a plan of breathtaking risk. He would not besiege Lydda, he would decapitate it in a single lightning strike. He gathered his column of jeeps and placed his own vehicle at its head. The plan was simple, and to many it sounded like suicide. They would drive directly into the heart of the town. With a roar of engines, the column charged. They burst past the outer defenses, a spearhead of raw nerve and firepower, racing straight down the main street. Firing from their machine guns in all directions, they became a whirlwind of chaos. The Arab defenders, prepared for a cautious siege, were paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the attack. Panic ripped through their ranks. This single column, led by a one-eyed commander, created the illusion of a massive, unstoppable force. The chaos Dayan sowed was total, breaking the town's will to fight and leading to its eventual capture. It was pure Dayan, unconventional, brutally effective, and executed with a personal courage that bordered on the reckless. From the plains of Lydda, Dayan was sent to the most critical front of all, Jerusalem. He was appointed the military commander of the city, a position that carried the weight of 3,000 years of history. The situation he inherited was catastrophic. The Jewish quarter of the Old City had already fallen, its defenders killed or captured. West Jerusalem, the new city, was under a crippling siege, pounded daily by Jordanian artillery and legionnaire attacks. Food and water were scarce, morale was collapsing, and the front line was a fluid, terrifying mess of street-to-street, house-to-house combat. It was a sniper's war, fought from shattered windows and across rubble-strewn alleys. The fight for Jerusalem was not just a military objective, it was an existential struggle for the soul of the nation. For Dayan, the thought of losing the city was an impossibility, a failure that could not be contemplated. He threw himself into its defense with a ferocious energy. He was a whirlwind of motion, constantly at the front lines, a stark contrast to commanders who remained in protected headquarters. Soldiers clinging to a barricade would suddenly see him appear, his black eye patch a symbol of defiance. He would calmly assess the enemy positions, direct machine gun fire, and speak with the weary men, his presence a jolt of electricity. He did not give grand speeches, instead he gave them his proximity to danger, sharing their risk, and in doing so, rekindling their hope. One soldier later recalled the profound impact he had on the exhausted defenders. He had the scent of the battlefield. When Dayan was around, you felt that victory was possible no matter the odds. This was his true genius as a commander. He understood that in a desperate siege, the most powerful weapon was not a cannon, but the will to fight. He personally led small patrols to probe enemy weak spots, often drawing fire to reveal their positions. He treated the map of Jerusalem not as a strategic chart, but as his own backyard, learning every alley and every ruin. His orders were crisp, clear, and always aimed at seizing the initiative, however small. He was not merely defending Jerusalem, he was actively fighting for every inch of it, instilling a sense of purpose back into soldiers who were on the verge of collapse. Amidst the constant crack of rifle fire and the crump of mortar shells, one of the most surreal episodes of the war unfolded. The fighting in Jerusalem had reached a bloody stalemate. Both sides were exhausted, their front lines a tangled mess of fortified houses and barricades. It was then that Moshe Dayan the warrior revealed his other self, Dayan the pragmatist. A meeting was arranged. In a bullet-scarred, abandoned house located in the lethal zone of no man's land, he came face to face with his adversary, the Jordanian commander Abdullah El Tel. There were no diplomats, no politicians, just two enemy officers in dusty battle fatigues. They met not as mortal enemies, but as professional soldiers who understood the brutal arithmetic of war. Over a simple table, they unrolled a map of the city they were trying to destroy. With a grease pencil, they began to draw a line, a crude squiggle that wound its way through neighborhoods, streets, and sometimes even through houses. This line, sketched out in a ruined building, while the battle still raged outside, would become the armistice line. It would divide Jerusalem for the next 19 years, a stark, physical scar representing a frozen conflict. This moment revealed a core aspect of Dayan's character. He knew how to start a fight and how to lead one with a terrifying audacity, but he also knew when and how to end one. His heroism in Jerusalem propelled him into the Israeli Defense Forces High Command, where he would be given the ultimate responsibility to reforge the entire army in his own audacious image. By 1953, the state of Israel had survived its birth, but lived in a state of constant, simmering hostility. Its military, the Israeli Defense Forces, was a citizen army forged in the desperate War of Independence, skilled in defense but shackled by a reactive posture. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, the nation's founding father, saw this as a fatal flaw in a neighborhood of enemies. He needed a commander who could break the mold, someone who saw offense not as recklessness, but as the ultimate form of defense. He needed a leader with fire, vision, and a deep-seated impatience for the cautious bureaucracy that defined the old guard. His gaze fell upon a charismatic, controversial, and brilliant 40-year-old officer, Moshe Dayan. The decision to appoint Dayan as the fourth chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces was a shockwave through the military establishment. He was promoted over a dozen more senior, more experienced, and arguably more conventional generals. Many saw him as an impulsive adventurer, a political maverick who lacked the discipline for high command, but Ben-Gurion saw something else entirely. He saw a mind unburdened by dogma, a warrior who understood the language of the modern battlefield, and a leader who embodied the audacity Israel needed to survive. Ben-Gurion was not looking for a manager. He was looking for a revolutionary, a man who could fundamentally reshape the soul of the army. In Dayan, Ben-Gurion found his instrument of change. He famously articulated his reasoning with unwavering confidence, stating, "He has the quality of not fearing any man and the intellectual capacity for brilliant strategic thinking." This was not merely an appointment, it was a mandate. Dayan was tasked with a monumental mission: to transform the Israeli Defense Forces from a defensive militia into a proactive, agile, and overwhelmingly powerful fighting force. His objective was clear: build an army that could take the fight to the enemy, deep within their territory, and win quickly and decisively, ensuring Israel's survival through strength and deterrence. Dayan immediately set about dismantling the old ways of thinking, instituting a radical new military philosophy that came to be known as the Dayan Doctrine. This was not a subtle shift in policy. It was a complete overhaul of Israel's strategic and tactical approach to warfare. The doctrine was built on a foundation of aggressive, offensive action, predicated on the belief that for a small nation with no strategic depth, a prolonged war of attrition was unwinnable. The only path to victory was to seize the initiative and dictate the terms of any conflict before the enemy had a chance to act. At the core of his doctrine was the principle of preemption. Dayan argued that Israel could not afford to absorb the first blow. When an enemy attack was imminent and undeniable, Israel had to strike first, disrupting enemy plans and fighting on its own terms. Equally revolutionary was his emphasis on initiative at the lowest levels. He cultivated a culture of follow-me leadership, empowering junior officers to make critical decisions on the battlefield without waiting for orders from high command. He wanted leaders, not just managers, on the front lines, men who could adapt, improvise, and exploit opportunities as they arose. This fostered a dynamic and unpredictable fighting style that would repeatedly catch Israel's enemies off guard. Dayan's vision for maneuver was equally innovative. He abhorred costly, head-on assaults against fortified positions. Instead, he championed the indirect approach, using speed, surprise, and flanking maneuvers to bypass enemy strongpoints and strike at their vulnerable rear areas. This required the seamless integration of different military branches, a concept he relentlessly pushed as combined arms warfare. Under his leadership, infantry, armor, and the burgeoning Israeli Air Force trained together constantly, learning to operate as a single lethal instrument of war. The tank was no longer just infantry support. It was the main breakthrough force, with infantry clearing its path and air power providing a protective umbrella and devastating firepower. To spearhead these audacious operations, Dayan cultivated elite units, particularly the paratroopers, as the tip of the spear. These were not just soldiers, they were the embodiment of his doctrine, trained to be aggressive, self-reliant, and capable of operating deep behind enemy lines. He implemented this revolution through a culture of relentless and realistic training. Exercises were brutal and demanding. Commanders who were not aggressive enough, who hesitated or clung to outdated defensive tactics, were summarily fired. He fostered a climate where calculated risk-taking was not just tolerated but rewarded, creating a generation of commanders who were bold, creative, and utterly committed to his offensive vision. This frantic transformation was not happening in a vacuum. Throughout the mid-1950s, the strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly. In Egypt, the charismatic and ambitious Gamal Abdel Nasser rose to power, becoming a champion of pan-Arab nationalism and a sworn enemy of Israel. His rhetoric grew increasingly hostile, and his actions backed up his words. He armed his military with modern weaponry from the Soviet bloc, creating a formidable threat on Israel's southern border. The tension escalated dramatically when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital international waterway. For Israel, the threat became existential when Nasser imposed a blockade on the Straits of Tiran, cutting off the nation's southern port of Eilat and strangling its economic lifeline to Asia and Africa. This act of war was compounded by a growing campaign of terror. Nasser actively sponsored and armed Palestinian Fedayeen militants who launched cross-border raids from Gaza and the Sinai, attacking Israeli farms, villages, and civilians. The constant fear and bloodshed created an unbearable pressure on the Israeli government to act decisively. The relentless training, the doctrinal revolution, and the forging of a new military spirit were all converging on a single point. Dayan and the army he had built were not preparing for a hypothetical war. They were preparing for a specific and seemingly inevitable conflict with Nasser's Egypt. The theories of preemption and combined arms warfare were about to be put to the ultimate test. The theoretical doctrines and grueling training were over. Now, Dayan would unleash his newly forged army in a campaign so swift and decisive it would stun the world. The year was 1956, and the Middle East was a powder keg. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, buoyed by Soviet arms, had nationalized the Suez Canal, blockaded the Straits of Tiran, and unleashed Fedayeen terror raids against Israeli civilians. In the shadows, a secret alliance formed between Israel, Britain, and France, each with its own reasons for confronting Nasser. For Moshe Dayan, now Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, this was the moment to implement the doctrine he had championed for years. His objective was not conquest, but a devastating preemptive strike. He aimed to shatter the Egyptian army's infrastructure in the Sinai, obliterate the Fedayeen bases, and force open the vital shipping lanes. Dayan's plan, codenamed Operation Kadesh, was a masterpiece of audacity. It was a direct reflection of his belief in speed, surprise, and indirect approaches. Conventional wisdom dictated a slow, methodical advance, but Dayan envisioned a lightning strike that would paralyze the enemy before they could even react. The plan was a massive gamble hinging on a single daring move, designed to act as both a lure and a strategic anchor. He would drop a battalion of paratroopers deep inside enemy territory, more than 100 miles from the Israeli border, at the eastern entrance of the Mitla Pass. This isolated force was the bait, a challenge Nasser's army could not ignore. While the Egyptians focused on this unexpected threat, Dayan would unleash his main forces. 3 powerful, fast-moving armored columns would thrust across the desert along separate axes. One would drive south towards Sharm el-Sheikh to open the straits. Another would strike at the heavily fortified Egyptian command center at Abu Agela. The third would race directly towards the Suez Canal. The entire operation was designed to be a blur of motion, relying completely on the initiative of his field commanders to exploit opportunities as they arose. It was a plan that could lead to a spectacular victory or a catastrophic disaster with very little room in between. On the afternoon of October 29th, the operation began. As Israeli fighter jets screamed overhead, transport planes dropped 395 paratroopers into the heart of the Sinai. The armored brigades surged across the border, their engines roaring a new anthem of war. Dayan was not in some distant, sterile command bunker. He was where he always believed a commander should be, circling high above the chaos in a small Piper Cub plane. With a map spread across his knees and a radio crackling with reports, he was the all-seeing eye of the offensive, a conductor directing his violent symphony from the sky. He personally orchestrated the battle, his voice a calm presence amid the storm of combat. He directed air support, rerouted columns to bypass resistance, and gave his commanders the freedom to act. He would land his small aircraft on hastily cleared desert strips, dust billowing around him, to confer face-to-face with commanders like the aggressive young Ariel Sharon, whose paratroopers were fighting desperately at the Mitla Pass. This was hands-on leadership of a kind rarely seen. Dayan was not just a strategist, he was a battlefield manager, sharing the risks and the immediacy of the fight with his men on the ground. The Israeli advance was terrifyingly swift. At the critical crossroads of Abu Agila, a complex of trenches, minefields, and artillery positions, Israeli forces executed a brilliant combined arms assault. They outflanked, overwhelmed, and shattered the Egyptian defenses in a single night. The Egyptian army, trained for a static, set-piece war, was completely disoriented. They were prepared for an infantry crawl, not an armored blitzkrieg that materialized out of the desert dust. Their command and control systems collapsed under the relentless pressure. Every Egyptian countermove was a step behind the Israeli advance. The fighting at the Mitla Pass became a brutal testament to the ferocity of the campaign. Sharon's paratroopers, initially ordered to hold their position, pushed into the narrow canyon and were ambushed, leading to a bloody and controversial battle. Dayan, while privately furious at the breach of discipline, publicly supported his commander, understanding that the very doctrine of initiative he fostered would sometimes lead to such actions. The battle was won, but at a high cost, a grim reminder of the price of war. Yet, across the peninsula, the momentum was unstoppable. Egyptian units, cut off and confused, began to disintegrate, abandoning their new Soviet equipment as they fled west. In just 100 hours, it was over. The Israeli Defense Forces had conquered the entire Sinai Peninsula, reaching the banks of the Suez Canal. The Egyptian army was routed, its vast arsenal of Soviet weaponry captured or destroyed. The Straits of Tiran were open, and the Fedayeen bases in Gaza and the Sinai were eliminated. Israel's southern border was secure. The world watched in stunned admiration. Moshe Dayan was hailed as a military genius, the architect of one of the most decisive victories in modern warfare. The Lightning Campaign was a stunning validation of his military philosophy. He had proven that a small, well-trained, and audaciously led army could defeat a numerically superior foe through speed, intelligence, and sheer force of will. The victory solidified the reputation of the Israeli Defense Forces as a formidable fighting force and cemented Dayan's legacy as one of history's great commanders. He had remade the army in his own image, daring, unconventional, and victorious. The Sinai victory bought Israel a decade of relative quiet, a precious period of calm earned with blood and brilliance. The storm, however, was only gathering strength on the horizon. When the next crisis erupted, the nation would once again turn to Dayan, not as the military commander shaping the battle, but as the political symbol of resolve a terrified populace would demand in its most perilous hour. The spring of 1967 descended upon Israel not with renewal, but with a suffocating blanket of dread. An existential threat, long dormant, had reawakened with terrifying speed. In Egypt, President Gamal Abdel Nasser, his voice booming across Arab radio waves, announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran, strangling Israel's southern maritime lifeline. United Nations peacekeepers, the buffer in the Sinai for a decade, were unceremoniously expelled. In their place, hundreds of thousands of Egyptian soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks poured into the desert, their gun barrels pointed east. Jordan's King Hussein signed a defense pact with Egypt, placing his army under Egyptian command while Syrian artillery on the Golan Heights zeroed in on the kibbutzim below. The rhetoric was not of politics or territory, but of annihilation. A chilling paralysis gripped the Israeli public. This was the waiting period, 3 weeks of agonizing suspense where the nation held its breath. The buoyant confidence of the young country evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. Parks in Tel Aviv were consecrated as potential mass burial sites, and schoolchildren helped fill sandbags. Civil defense trenches were dug along city streets, a grim reminder of the nation's vulnerability. The government, led by the thoughtful but seemingly hesitant Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, appeared indecisive. His stuttering radio addresses did little to calm a populace that felt the enemy closing in from all sides. In this crucible of anxiety, a single name became a national chant, a desperate plea for a proven savior: Dayan. The people demanded the man with the eye patch, the hero of the Sinai campaign, the symbol of Israeli audacity. The public pressure became an unstoppable political force. Delegations of citizens and opposition leaders descended on the Prime Minister's office. The message was unequivocal. The nation had lost faith in the current leadership's ability to navigate the storm. They needed a warrior, not a politician, at the helm of the military. On June 1st, just 4 days before the storm broke, Eshkol relented. He appointed Moshe Dayan as Minister of Defense. The effect was immediate and electric. A wave of profound relief and renewed confidence washed over the country, dispelling the fog of fear almost overnight. The national mood transformed from one of impending doom to one of grim determination. The hero of Sinai was back in charge. His appointment was a psychological masterstroke. The sight of Dayan, his iconic eye patch a symbol of past sacrifice and victory, striding into the Ministry of Defense galvanized the nation and the army. He was the living embodiment of Israeli resolve. While the brilliant and detailed war plan, codenamed Operation Focus, had been meticulously developed by the Israeli Defense Forces General Staff under Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, it was Dayan who provided the final, crucial ingredient. He gave the plan the political legitimacy and the spiritual authority it needed. He was the man who could look the cabinet, the nation, and the world in the eye and give the order to unleash the coiled spring of Israel's military power. He did not create the strategy, but he became its indispensable face. On the morning of June 5th, the waiting ended. In a stunning display of precision and daring, the Israeli Air Force executed Rabin's plan flawlessly. Flying low to avoid radar, wave after wave of jets struck Egyptian airfields, destroying over 300 aircraft on the ground in a matter of hours. With a single devastating blow, Israel had achieved air supremacy, effectively winning the war before the ground forces had even fully engaged. Dayan, as defense minister, was not a field commander issuing tactical orders, but he was the ultimate authority, overseeing the grand strategic symphony of a multi-front war. As Israeli armor surged across the Sinai and engaged Syrian forces on the Golan, Dayan's attention turned to the one prize that transcended military objectives: Jerusalem. The battle for the Old City was fierce and fraught with risk. Dayan, ever the soldier, refused to remain in a command bunker. He joined the paratroopers of the 55th Brigade as they prepared for their final push. On June 7th, after brutal house-to-house fighting, they breached the ancient walls. Dayan walked among them, a general in the midst of his men, as they advanced through the Lion's Gate. The air was thick with the smoke of battle and the weight of 2,000 years of history. He was not just a politician inspecting a victory, he was a participant in the fulfillment of a national dream, stepping into a part of the city Jews had been barred from for nearly 2 decades. The culmination of this moment, and perhaps of his entire life, came minutes later. Surrounded by battle-hardened, dust-covered paratroopers, many of whom were openly weeping, Dayan reached the Western Wall. This was the last remnant of the Second Temple, the holiest site in Judaism. For centuries, it had been a symbol of exile and longing. Now it was in Israeli hands. Helmet clutched in his hand, Dayan stood before the ancient stones, a silent witness to the raw, overwhelming emotion of the soldiers touching the wall, praying and connecting with their history. The image of his weathered face, his one eye gazing at the sacred stones, was broadcast around the globe. It became the defining photograph of the war, a portrait of triumph, relief, and historical destiny. At that hallowed spot, Dayan, the secular kibbutznik, found words that resonated with the soul of his nation. He took a slip of paper and, following ancient tradition, placed a prayer in a crevice of the wall. Then he delivered a message to the world that was broadcast over a military radio, his voice steady and resolute. "We have returned to our holiest of places, never to be parted from them again," he declared. It was a statement of both military victory and profound spiritual homecoming. The Six-Day War had redrawn the map of the Middle East, but for Dayan and for Israel, the capture of the Western Wall had redrawn the boundaries of history itself. This was the absolute zenith of his career, the moment his legend was permanently forged in the stones of Jerusalem. He stood at the pinnacle of glory, the invincible hero of an invincible nation. But hubris is the shadow of victory, and the greatest trial of his life was looming in the silence of an autumn afternoon. For 6 years, Israel lived in the warm afterglow of its stunning 1967 victory. The nation's confidence, personified by its one-eyed defense minister, seemed unbreakable. This confidence was built on a foundation of military and intelligence certainty, known simply as the concept. This doctrine, the conceptia, was an article of faith within the Israeli High Command. It held 2 simple truths. Egypt would never launch a major war until it could neutralize the Israeli Air Force, and Syria would never dare to attack Israel without its Egyptian ally. This belief, so logical and so thoroughly accepted, created a dangerous blind spot. It fostered a sense of complacency that would soon lead the nation to the edge of an abyss. As the sun began to set on October 6, 1973, a profound quiet fell across the country. It was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the most sacred day in the Jewish calendar. The streets were empty, the radios silent, the nation deep in prayer and fasting. Inside the military command bunker, the initial reports were dismissed as minor skirmishes or another false alarm. But they kept coming, growing in scale and intensity until the truth was undeniable. The impossible was happening. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Yom Kippur silence was shattered by the thunder of 1,000 artillery pieces. Egypt and Syria had launched a massive, perfectly coordinated two-front surprise attack. In the south, Egyptian commandos stormed the Suez Canal in rubber dinghies, using high-pressure water cannons to blast through the sand ramparts of the supposedly impregnable Bar-Lev line. Behind them, entire armored divisions poured across pontoon bridges into the Sinai. In the north, a tidal wave of over 1,000 Syrian tanks surged into the Golan Heights, overwhelming the small Israeli force stationed there. Disbelief turned to horror in the command center. The conceptia had not just been wrong, it had been catastrophically, fatally wrong. Israel was fighting for its life. The invincible hero of 1967 was gone, replaced by a man staring into the abyss. The initial reports reaching Moshe Dayan were apocalyptic. Fortifications were falling, tanks were being destroyed by new Soviet anti-tank missiles, and Israeli casualties were mounting at an unbearable rate. The fronts were collapsing. The speed and ferocity of the assault shook him to his core. For the first time, Dayan, the man who had only known victory, confronted the terrifying possibility of total defeat. The weight of the nation's survival pressed down on him, and for a moment, it seemed to crush him. Those who saw him in those first desperate hours described a man utterly broken, his face a mask of anguish. The legendary confidence had evaporated, replaced by a profound and visible despair. He felt the colossal weight of personal responsibility for the intelligence failure and the country's unpreparedness. This private torment spilled into public view during a televised press conference that would haunt the nation for decades. Facing the cameras, his voice heavy with exhaustion and grief, Dayan did not offer reassurance. Instead, he spoke of a grave crisis, warning of heavy losses and a long, difficult war. He then uttered a phrase that sent a shockwave of terror through every Israeli home. He spoke of the potential for the destruction of the Third Temple, a metaphor for the annihilation of the modern state of Israel. It was a statement of almost unimaginable despair from the country's chief protector. The nation, which looked to him for strength, saw a man on the brink of collapse. The vibrant, decisive commander of the Six-Day War was now a tormented leader, grappling with a national catastrophe that had unfolded under his watch. The hero seemed to have lost his nerve at the moment he was needed most. Yet beneath the surface of despair, the steel of a lifetime warrior remained. As the initial shock subsided, Dayan's strategic brilliance began to re-emerge from the fog of war. He forced himself to look past the devastating losses and focus on the cold, hard calculus of survival. Amid the chaos and conflicting advice from his generals, he made two critical decisions that would fundamentally alter the course of the war. His first and most crucial choice was to prioritize the northern front. While the Egyptian army in the Sinai was larger, Dayan correctly identified the Syrian advance on the Golan Heights as the more immediate existential threat. A Syrian breakthrough there could put tanks within striking distance of Israel's major population centers in a matter of hours. He ordered the reserves and the bulk of the Israeli Air Force to be directed north, a move that flew in the face of calls to stabilize the collapsing Sinai front. It was a high-stakes gamble, leaving the South dangerously thin, but it was the right one. The Israeli forces on the Golan, though massively outnumbered, fought with desperate courage, buying precious time until reinforcements arrived to push the Syrians back. Having stabilized the north, Dayan turned his attention south. Here he made his second momentous decision. He gave his full backing to a controversial and audacious plan proposed by General Ariel Sharon to punch a hole in the Egyptian lines, cross the Suez Canal, and attack the Egyptian armies from the rear. Many in the high command thought the plan was reckless, a foolhardy risk that could lead to an even greater disaster. But Dayan saw its strategic genius. He understood that a defensive battle would only lead to a bloody stalemate. This was a chance to seize the initiative and win. His approval of the crossing was the turning point of the war on the Southern Front, a move that encircled and trapped the Egyptian Third Army, ultimately leading to victory. From the jaws of defeat, Dayan had helped snatch a military miracle. Though Israel achieved a stunning military victory, the psychological scars of 1973 ran deep. The war shattered the nation's sense of invincibility and cost over 2,500 lives. For Dayan, the public perception of his role was complex. He was both the man who presided over the initial failure and the strategist who helped engineer the comeback. His political career seemed to be over, his legacy forever tarnished by the war's painful opening days. For Dayan, the war marked the end of one chapter and the unexpected beginning of his final and perhaps most important mission. The initial euphoria of the Israeli Defense Forces' counterattack in the Yom Kippur War quickly evaporated, replaced by a deep and lingering national trauma. Though a military victory was ultimately secured, the price was staggering, paid in the blood of thousands of young soldiers. The country was wounded, not just by the casualties, but by the shattering of its sense of invincibility. A profound sense of vulnerability swept through a nation that had believed its borders were impregnable and its intelligence infallible. The initial surprise attack was a failure of imagination and a failure of leadership that the public could not forgive. In the war's bitter aftermath, the Agranat Commission was established to investigate the catastrophic lack of preparedness. Its findings sent shockwaves through the political and military establishment. While the commission ultimately cleared Moshe Dayan of direct legal responsibility, the court of public opinion was far less merciful. For the Israeli people, he was the minister of defense, the man whose watchful eye was meant to protect them. The image of the confident, all-knowing commander was gone, replaced by a man who had admitted to misjudging the enemy. The public anger was immense, a torrent of grief and accusation directed at the leadership. The political pressure became unbearable. The hero of 1967 was now the symbol of the failures of 1973. His legendary status could not shield him from the nation's pain. In 1974, bowing to the inevitable, Moshe Dayan resigned from his post. Prime Minister Golda Meir, another giant of Israel's founding generation, resigned alongside him. It was the end of an era. For Dayan, it was a brutal fall from grace, a period of political exile where his once unassailable reputation lay in ruins. The warrior was cast out, his iconic eye patch now seen by many as a symbol of a blind spot that had cost the nation dearly. For 3 years, Dayan remained on the political sidelines. Then, in a move that stunned the entire country, his career was unexpectedly resurrected. In 1977, Menachem Begin, the leader of the rival Likud party and a lifelong political opponent, became prime minister. In his first and most shocking cabinet appointment, Begin asked Moshe Dayan to serve as his foreign minister. The decision was a masterstroke of political pragmatism. Begin, a man viewed with suspicion by many in the international community, knew he needed Dayan's global prestige, his strategic brilliance, and his undeniable credibility as a warrior. He needed the man who had fought the Arabs to now make peace with them. Dayan accepted, seizing the opportunity to reshape his legacy. He shed his military fatigues for the diplomat's suit, embarking on the most crucial mission of his life. This new role would demand a different kind of courage, one waged not on the battlefield, but in secret rooms and clandestine negotiations. It was here that Dayan's true genius for unorthodox thinking reemerged. He understood that formal channels were clogged with decades of mistrust and rhetoric. A breakthrough required a personal, secret touch. He became Begin's shadow emissary, the essential bridge to the Arab world. The most critical of these missions took him to Morocco. Under the cover of secrecy, he flew to meet with King Hassan II, who acted as an intermediary. There, Dayan held a series of clandestine meetings with Hassan Tohami, a close and trusted deputy of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. These conversations, held far from the public eye, laid the vital groundwork for what was to come. He was direct, pragmatic, and earned the Egyptians' trust. Dayan was the living embodiment of Israeli military strength, and his willingness to talk peace carried immense weight. He was the warrior who could credibly offer a pact of non-aggression because he had personally delivered the alternative. He articulated his philosophy with profound simplicity, a statement that would define his final chapter. He knew that true progress could only be made by engaging with the adversary. Dayan famously stated, "If you want to make peace, you do not talk to your friends. You talk to your enemies." This principle guided his every move, allowing him to cut through decades of animosity. His secret diplomacy was a resounding success, culminating in the single most dramatic event in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. President Anwar Sadat's historic announcement that he would travel to Jerusalem to address the Knesset. Dayan had opened the door. His work was not yet finished. The momentum from Sadat's visit led directly to the grueling negotiations at Camp David in the United States. For 13 intense days in 1978, Dayan was a pivotal figure, navigating the complex personalities of President Jimmy Carter, a resolute Menachem Begin, and an equally determined Anwar Sadat. He was the voice of creative compromise, using his deep understanding of security needs to design a withdrawal from the Sinai that Israel could accept. He helped persuade a reluctant Begin that land could be exchanged for a true and lasting peace, a concept that was revolutionary at the time. The relentless effort paid off. In 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed on the White House lawn. It was the first peace agreement between Israel and an Arab nation, a monumental achievement that redrew the map of the Middle East. For Dayan, it was the culmination of a lifetime spent in conflict. The man who had planned the Sinai campaign of 1956 was now the architect of its return. The commander who had conquered territories in all of Israel's major wars dedicated his final years to securing a peace that made those wars a memory rather than a prelude. Shortly after this triumph, with his health failing from a long battle with cancer, Dayan resigned from the government over disagreements on policy towards the Palestinians. He had completed his final mission. Moshe Dayan died in 1981, his life a complete arc of service to the state. He left behind a legacy as complex and contradictory as Israel itself. He was the brilliant Sabra general of 1956, the triumphant symbol of 1967, the flawed and humbled leader of 1973, and finally the visionary peacemaker of 1979. He remains an enduring, complicated, and utterly essential figure in the epic story of Israel, a warrior who ultimately found his greatest purpose in the pursuit of peace.